Hello guys! Tonight, we drift far beyond memory, back into the hush of the very first cities, to a land shaped by rivers, ruled by gods, and scribbled into history, one clay tablet at a time. Before the pyramids, before the Parthenon, there was Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers. And beneath its sun-baked bricks and laws carved in stone, love still flickered, quiet, hidden, and often forbidden. Before we get started, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe. Only if you're really enjoying the content I share here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this little community reaches. Now lower the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some relaxing background noise, and let's settle in for tonight's story. Let the world fall away for now. Dim the lights, imagine warm air settling over mud-brick rooftops. Somewhere in the distance, a reed flute is playing, slow, wandering notes drifting through palm trees. A breeze rolls in from the Euphrates, smelling faintly of silt, barley bread, and lamp oil. You are no longer here. You are in Babylon, or perhaps just after dusk, as oil lamps are lit one by one, casting amber shadows across narrow alleys and sandstone walls. The streets are emptying. Scribes are rolling up their reed styluses, merchants are closing their stalls, and temple boys are gathering half-eaten offerings to toss into the river. But behind some of those mud-brick walls, quiet as breath, secrets live. Secrets shaped like longing, whispered like prayers, and carved into clay with trembling hands. In this world, everything has its place, and everything, even affection, has a rule. There are laws here, many, hundreds in fact, written centuries ago by a king named Hammurabi and baked into tablets for eternity. They tell you who you may marry, who you may not touch, who must be punished, and how. Desire, in this world, is not yours. It belongs to your family, your gods, and the scribes who write it down, but not everyone listens. In the heart of the city, just beside the main road that leads to the great ziggurat, lives a woman named Enlila. She's no priestess, no nobleman's daughter. She manages her father's date stall, sells jars of sesame oil, and once bartered a broken spindle for a painted bowl. Her voice is low, her feet bare, her shoulders freckled from too much sun. Her hair smells of dried myrtle leaves. She is no one. And yet, someone watches her. Across the street, inside the temple compound, a young apprentice scribe named Dagan studies laws by lamplight. He's meant to memorize clauses about property rights and canal boundaries. Instead, he glances too often out the window toward the woman arranging dates in woven baskets. He tells himself it's just curiosity, but his heart, annoyingly, disagrees. They speak sometimes, briefly, quietly, always with someone else nearby. A comment about the dust, a question about the weather, a borrowed jar, nothing improper. But in a city where even a misplaced glance could become gossip, it is already too much. And it is dangerous because Dagan isn't free. His position at the temple comes with rules. His future, if he is lucky, might lead to a priesthood or marriage arranged by his superiors. Enlila is not even from his district. And besides, the code is clear. If a temple apprentice is caught engaging with a woman outside approved lineage, the punishment is public. Harsh. Humiliating, perhaps even final. But love, or something that looks too much like it, has never been very good at reading clay tablets. As evening deepens and frogs begin to croak near the canals, Dagan takes a risk. He crosses the street, just once, just to return a bowl he claims was left behind. His fingers tremble slightly as he hands it over. Enlila says nothing, but her eyes, lined with quiet sleepiness and the candle-light glow, pause a second longer than necessary. It is a moment so brief, it might be mistaken for nothing. But it is the beginning. The next day, she brings him a date wrapped in a linen scrap. He doesn't eat it. Not right away. He places it on his work tablet and stares at it like it holds the answers to all the wrong questions. In the evenings that follow, their glances grow longer. A note is passed, written in simple Akkadian, scratched on a small tablet, hidden inside a bundle of barley. The writing is clumsy, the meaning unmistakable. Do you dream of me as I dream of you? He never answers in words. But one morning, after sweeping the temple court, Enlila finds a tiny wax tablet tucked into a crevice in the wall. On it, a single symbol, the moon god's eye, watcher of night secrets. Thus begins their ritual. They leave tokens, clay fragments, pressed petals, bits of string knotted in pairs no one else sees, or if they do, they say nothing. But the city sees everything, especially when it shouldn't. One humid morning, a temple scribe named Ishbi Adu finds a dropped token near the oil jars, a small piece of fired clay shaped like a heart with a name carved faintly into the underside. It is Enlila's name. The whisper begins, as all such whispers do, not in anger but in curiosity laced with amusement, then with envy, and finally suspicion. It spreads through market stalls and temple corridors. It reaches the ears of Dagan's overseer. It rustles behind Enlila's back as she walks past the goat sellers. And just like that, their quiet romance, born of glances and clay, begins to shift from silence to scrutiny. The next phase is coming, but for now, let the lamps glow, let the river murmur, let this forbidden affection sleep beneath the hum of an ancient city that has seen everything and forgotten nothing. There is a strange quiet in Babylon just after sunrise, when the city hasn't yet caught its breath and the air is still soft, full of dew and distant cooing from rooftop pigeons. The sun creeps over the ziggurat, casting long shadows down alleyways where yesterday's dust still lies undisturbed. It's the hour when the streets are swept, the fires relit, and the memory of dreams lingers in the hearts of those who dared dream too vividly. And on this morning, Dagan stands alone at the edge of the temple courtyard, holding a wax tablet he can no longer justify keeping. He turns it over slowly in his hand. It's stained slightly from the oil in his tunic pocket, the edges smoothed from repeated touching. The symbol on it, the eye of the moon god, was once meant to be a tender gesture, a private echo of an unspoken vow. But now it's a weight, a risk, a thing that could bring ruin with a single misstep. Across the street, Enlila arranges her dates in silence. The market has just begun to stir. Merchants yawning, stretching their arms, muttering blessings to keep rodents away. No one looks twice at her. She moves like water over stone, practiced, invisible. But Dagan watches. Not as a man in love might watch with a smile, but as a man unsure if today will be the last time. The whisper that began with a dropped token has slithered its way into the hands of people with power. Not the kings or high priests. No, such affairs rarely reach those altitudes unless scandal promises to entertain them. But among the temple stewards, the grain clerks, the junior scribes who maintain the ledgers and recite the old codes, it has become a topic, a game of speculation. They speak in hushed tones near the grain silos between the lines of laws carved in stone. Did you see the way he passed the dates? Did you hear the story about the temple boy and the date seller? No names are spoken aloud. That would risk implication. But the silence now holds a shape, and Dagan feels it in the way the overseer watches him too long. in how the head scribe asks him twice whether he's copied Section 129 of Hammurabi's code, the one about improper conduct between a woman and a man not her husband. It's a warning dressed in protocol. And so Dagan withdraws. He leaves no tokens. He no longer lingers near Enlila's stall. His gaze drops when she looks toward him, and he busies himself with tasks he used to perform absent-mindedly, but now stretch into tedious devotion. He even volunteers to recopy laws he already knows by heart, just to avoid walking near the market. Enlila notices. Of course she does. She says nothing. For days. But then one dusk, as she places her unsold dates into cloth sacks, she finds a fragment tucked under her scales. Not a tablet, not a note. Just a broken potsherd with a single thumbprint pressed into the center, unmistakably his. She closes her eyes and exhales through her nose. She does not cry. Tears are for children and for old women in mourning. She is neither. Later that night, alone in her room behind the stall, a space barely wide enough to lie down in, she kneels and presses her forehead to the dirt floor, whispering a short prayer to Inanna, goddess of love and war. It is not a request. It is not even gratitude. It is something closer to confession. I loved without permission. I loved without promise. And still I did. Outside, the city buzzes softly. Somewhere nearby, a storyteller recounts a myth to children gathered near a small fire. It's one of those ancient stories passed down not by scribes but by breath, about the god Enki, falling in love with a woman forbidden to him, and how the river swallowed his sorrow. The story ends, as it always does, with silence. The storyteller trailing off and letting the flames speak the rest. The next morning, Enlila walks past the temple compound deliberately. She doesn't glance toward Dagan's quarters, but she knows he's watching. She can feel it, like the warmth of sun through a sheer linen veil. She doesn't stop walking, but she slows enough to brush her fingers over the corner of the stone fence, the place where they used to hide their messages. It's a gesture so subtle, it might have been a twitch. But to Dagan, watching from the shadows, it is as loud as thunder. That night, he cannot sleep. He lies on his thin mat, staring at the wooden rafters of his chamber, listening to the scuttling of mice and the wind rattling dry palm fronds against the walls. His roommate snores softly nearby, blissfully unaware of the war raging between duty and longing just a few feet away. Dagan closes his eyes, but instead of sleep, he sees the outline of her fingers, the calloused pads, the slight curve of her thumb, the way she always smelled faintly of crushed figs and market dust. By morning, he knows what he will do. He waits until the mid-afternoon heat forces most people into shaded corners. The temple court empties, save for a few old priests drowsing near the sacred pool. He slips into the archives, a room lined with rows of clay tablets arranged by date and topic. He selects one, blank, still soft. He lifts his stylus. The words come slowly, not because he doesn't know them, but because he wants them to be right. If the river judges us, let it judge the truth, that what I felt was not dishonor, but something older than law. He signs it only with a symbol, a reed by a stream. Then he breaks it in two. One half he buries under the fourth stone in the courtyard path, the one with the chip that looks like a crescent. The other he slides silently into a folded cloth meant for Enlila's oil jars, something that will reach her without question, carried by a messenger too dull to notice. That night, Enlila finds it. She reads it by lamplight, kneeling on her mat, the broken half cradled in her lap like a wounded bird. She does not smile, but something relaxes in her shoulders, in the line of her mouth. She lies down without prayer, without fear, and for the first time in days, sleeps without dreams. But even in this moment of silent reunion, the city continues to watch. Ishbi-Adu, the low-ranking scribe who first whispered suspicion, has not forgotten. And the overseer of temple conduct has begun recording Dagan's movements in the margins of a wax ledger. Not yet accusations, just notes. But in this city, notes become evidence, and evidence becomes action, and the code does not sleep. Outside the lover's awareness, gears begin to turn, quietly, patiently, like the rivers that cut through this ancient land, carving truths no one dares speak aloud. For now, though, Babylon rests. The moon rises over the ziggurat. Dogs bark in the distance. A lamp flickers in a tiny date store, then goes out. Two souls sleep beneath different roofs, but dream the same dream, of touch, of risk, of something bigger than both. In this moment, they are safe. In this moment, they are free. The days that followed passed slowly, as if time itself were reluctant to carry this story forward, like an old donkey dragging its hooves along a dusty road, unwilling to move because it knows what lies ahead. Babylon's sun was hotter than usual, baking the clay streets until they shimmered, bending light like illusions. The Euphrates crawled lazily, its waters low, its surface oily with pollen and the ash of evening incense. And beneath that quiet, the air was thick with knowing. Dagan rose each morning to the clanging bells of temple ritual. He washed his face in cool water drawn from a cistern, dressed in his rough robe, and recited the prescribed verses with lips that barely moved. He went through the motions of piety, but his mind clung to half-finished lines of thought, dreams unfinished, words he dared not speak aloud. Each day he passed the chipped stone where the tablet fragment lay buried and gave it a sidelong glance, as though checking if the earth had rejected it. It hadn't. Not yet. But there were other signs. The overseer now assigned Dagan to menial tasks, sweeping corridors, arranging ritual offerings, anything that would limit his access to the market streets. His wax tablets were collected and inspected at the end of each day. Questions were asked in a tone that pretended to be casual. How are you sleeping? Do you still feel your spirit is focused? Have you encountered any distractions? Dagan answered each with lowered eyes and a neutral voice, offering nothing but surface. Meanwhile, Enlila kept her head down. Her hands moved as always, deft and precise, tying bunches of dried figs, weighing sesame, counting copper rings into wooden bowls. But there was a stillness in her now. Not the natural calm she'd always carried like a second skin, but something more practiced, controlled. She didn't glance toward the temple compound anymore. She didn't pause by the wall. She never reached into the crevice, yet every evening when the market emptied and the stone streets grew cool underfoot, she lingered for just one heartbeat too long before walking away. Inside her small back room, by the glow of a single wick lamp, she traced symbols onto old broken sherds. Not for messages now, but for memory. A circle, a crescent, a river line. The eye of the moon god, the reed symbol for and, the character for if. She didn't need to bake these into permanence. They weren't meant for others. These were the echoes of things that could no longer be spoken. She scattered the fragments into a cloth pouch and buried them in a jar beneath her bed. Clay for thoughts too dangerous to live outside her walls. And still, the city whispered. Ishbi-Adu, the petty scribe with too much time and too little attention from his superiors, had taken to following Dagan from a distance. Always pretending to carry scrolls or run errands, he lingered near archways, eavesdropped on market stalls and made notes on scraps of palm paper, crude sketches of behavior, times, locations. Nothing yet actionable, but enough to stir unease. He reported quietly to the overseer. No new tokens, no direct interactions, but she lingers. He notices. They both pause. There's something unbroken there. Overseer grunted. Unbroken things draw attention, he muttered. They must be bent before they snap. And so came the inspection. It was subtle at first. A question asked of Enlila during a routine merchant's audit. How long have you had this store? The question was innocuous, the tone sharp. Then came another, a week later. Have you had contact with anyone in the temple on matters not involving trade? Again, phrased as procedure. But she knew, of course she knew. She answered with the calm of someone who had learned to place every word like a stone on a balanced scale. Only those who buy my dates, she said, eyes steady, and they rarely linger. The official scribbled something into his ledger. Not her answer, perhaps, just the fact that she didn't flinch. That night, for the first time in weeks, Dagan saw her. It was accidental, or it seemed that way. She was walking back from the river with an empty jug on her hip, her sandals thin, her hair caught back with a reed twist. He was returning from the archives with a scroll under his arm, the wax seal still warm. They met at the intersection where the alley behind the goat pens met the main road. For a moment, neither moved. The sun had dipped just behind the temple dome, casting a golden wash over the city. Dust swirled lazily between them. Enlila's jug shifted slightly on her hip. Dagan opened his mouth to speak. Something short, safe, benign. But she lifted one hand, not to hush him, but to speak in gesture alone. Not now, not here. Then she nodded once, not as farewell, but as recognition, and walked on. Dagan stood still, the moment vibrating in the quiet space between their retreating footsteps. He thought of section 154 of the code. If a man is found with another's betrothed, both shall be bound. He thought of the law against temple novices consorting with commoners. He thought of lashings, of exile, of being made to confess before a crowd. But more than anything, he thought of her eyes in that gold light. Not fearful, not desperate, but resilient. And he knew something then. The fear no longer had the same hold on him. Perhaps it never did. That night he returned to the archives, not for law tablets, not for ritual scrolls, but for a set of ancient hymns, poems to Inanna and Dumuzi, the goddess of love and her mortal consort. The verses were old, older than any code, older than kings. They spoke of longing, of risk, of joy laced with danger. He copied one onto a fresh tablet, slowly, reverently. Your words are honey, your silence a veil. In your eyes I see stars not yet named. Let the river rise, let the walls whisper. Still I will love you in the space law forgets. He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. He slipped it behind a hollow in the western temple wall, a place used long ago for old offerings, forgotten by most, remembered by him. Then he returned to his mat, lay down and exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. Far away, across the alley, and beyond the low walls of the market quarter, Enlila stirred in her sleep. The city dreamed on, heavy with heat and half-truths. And the code still waited, patient, watching, silent but never deaf. The sun had begun its descent again, casting the entire western quarter of Babylon in amber shadow. Even the grand ziggurat, which usually caught the last light of dusk, looked subdued now, as though the gods themselves had grown tired of watching. And yet, the people did not sleep. The city never truly did. It merely lowered its voice, shifted its posture, and continued to observe from the corners of shuttered windows and thin cloth awnings. It was in this hour, neither day nor night, that the temple guards began their new patrol route. It had been ordered quietly without public notice, a minor adjustment they called it, something to deter thieves, or so they said, but the real reason was less about security and more about visibility. 2 new guards now passed the temple's western wall every evening, just as the last vendors packed up their goods. It was the very wall behind which Dagan had slipped the cuneiform hymn, a poem of devotion hidden in a forgotten crevice meant for discarded offerings. He had no reason to believe anyone else would find it. The wall was ancient, cracked, and crumbling in parts. No one used that route unless they had to. But fear is like a fog. Even when you think it's cleared, it lingers in your lungs. So Dagan watched the wall each evening from a distance, feigning interest in nearby ledgers or pretending to adjust broken shelves. He never approached it again. Not openly, not yet. Enlila, on her side of the world, had noticed the same shift. The guards' new route brushed dangerously close to the market row, their leather sandals slapping stone in regular intervals, their eyes lingering longer than usual on those who worked late. She heard their voices once, low, deliberate. Not the casual banter of men on routine watch, but the kind of talk that carries an edge. Names were not spoken aloud, they never were. But implications hung in the air like the smell of burnt grain, hard to place, but impossible to ignore. Still, life must be lived. The barley must be measured, the dates must be sorted, the beer must be fetched from the brewer's daughter before it turned. And so Enlila continued as before, each task executed with the care of someone who knew she was being measured, not for her goods, but for her silences. One night she received a visit. It wasn't Dagan, it was a man older than both of them, his face worn, his robes simple. He introduced himself only as Sin, a name that meant little, and yet suggested lineage. He claimed to be a friend of her father's, though her father had died 3 harvests ago. He asked about her business, offered a polite smile, and remarked that her stall was positioned rather advantageously for watching the temple compound. She said nothing. Smiled once, offered him a fig, which he declined. Then he leaned slightly closer, enough for her to smell the faint scent of old scrolls and sandalwood oil on his skin, and said, "Sometimes the gods test us not with fire or plague, but with desire. The wise pass the test, the foolish make history." He left without waiting for a reply. That night, Enlila lay awake long after the lamp went out, listening to the rats scrabbling beneath her floorboards and the far-off sound of water jars clinking near the river. She had never seen that man before. She suspected she never would again. But she understood the message. She had been warned. Dagan, too, felt the tension thickening like summer air before a storm. The archive rooms now echoed differently, conversations hushed when he entered. The senior scribes who once patted his shoulder or commented on his neat handwriting now avoided his gaze. And the code, the endless tablets lined in rows, now felt less like law and more like threat. He began reading them differently. Before, the code had been a curiosity, a collection of strict guidelines meant to organize a world otherwise ruled by chaos, but now it felt personal. Each clause a possible trap, every sentence another door that could close. He reread section 129 until the words blurred. If a man's wife is found lying with another, they shall be bound and cast into the river. He wasn't married, nor was Enlila. But the message was clear. In this world, affection outside the lines wasn't merely frowned upon. It was an offense, an insult to structure, a crime against the very idea of hierarchy. And yet, despite all this, something ancient stirred in him, something older than law, the same something that must have stirred in the scribes who first penned the love poems of Inanna and Dumuzi. The same heat that pressed palms together in hidden courtyards, that caused glances to linger too long in temple corridors. It wasn't just rebellion, it wasn't just yearning, it was recognition, the unbearable awareness that another soul had found a rhythm that matched your own. So, one night, Dagan broke pattern. He waited until the lamps were low, until the priests had taken their evening meals, until the guards had made their slow walk past the western wall. Then he slipped away from the scribe's quarters, taking with him only a single palm leaf parcel wrapped in plain linen. He didn't go to Enlila's stall. That would be too obvious, too exposed. Instead, he took the long way, through the alleys behind the baker's kiln, past the courtyard where the children of merchants chased each other by torchlight. He entered the rear of the market row through a gap in the fence where goats sometimes squeezed through. And there, behind a stack of cracked amphorae, he waited. It wasn't long before she appeared. She carried a small sack of flour and pretended to be heading to her cousin's storage room. But when she saw him, she did not flinch. She didn't smile either. Her face remained still, composed, but her eyes flickered with something unspoken. He handed her the parcel without a word. Inside was a tablet no larger than a handbreadth. On it, he had written nothing but the symbol for if. The most dangerous word in any language. If the world were different, if the laws were kind, if love could be carried openly. She took it, slipped it into her sack. Then quietly she reached up and touched the side of his face with her fingers, rough from work, warm from effort. It was not a kiss. It was not even a promise. But it was enough. They parted without words, without a plan, without illusion. And somewhere in the city the code waited, not vengeful, not angry, just still. Like a net spread wide beneath a bird in flight. It didn't need to chase, it only needed patience. But for now, under a silver moon and the scent of burning cedar, two hearts beat a little faster than the law allowed. And Babylon, ever watching, blinked slowly, but did not yet strike. Morning returned to Babylon not with thunder, but with dust, the kind that clings to every surface, rising in soft clouds as sandals slap cobblestone, settling into folds of tunics, into pots of oil, into the lungs of those too tired to fight it. The city stretched itself awake like an old cat in the sun, slow and deliberate, with an air of weary dignity. And beneath it all, unseen and unheard, a single tablet sat tucked beneath a sack of flour in the corner of Enlila's storeroom, inscribed with the symbol for if. No one had seen her take it. No one had followed her directly. But in a city like Babylon, where secrets lingered in palm fronds and shadows spoke more fluently than words, someone always noticed something. That morning, Ishbi-Adu submitted a new report. He did not name Dagan, he did not accuse Enlila, but he described a series of movements, a scribe leaving his post briefly, an unscheduled route through the market quarter, a merchant woman walking back after curfew with a sealed parcel that looked oddly flat like a tablet might. He included a sketch of the alley. He noted the time. He ended his scroll with a single line, underlined in red ink. Possibility of violation under Code 131, liaisons between temple apprentice and unbound woman without formal declaration. The overseer didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. In Babylon, time was a weapon. Let suspicion ferment. Let fear do its slow, quiet work. Meanwhile, Dagan buried himself in routine. He copied rituals in triplicate. He organized prayer sequences for minor gods. He offered incense with hands that no longer trembled. He answered every question with calm detachment. When praised for his diligence, he bowed slightly and said nothing. But in the deep quiet of the archive room, between the weight of legal codes and the scent of ink and dust, he began a new scroll. Not for the temple, not for record, but for himself. A private chronicle, not of facts, but of feeling. He wrote, "The law may name me before it knows me. The law may claim me before it hears me, but I will write my truth in the gaps it forgets, in the spaces between what is said and what is lived." He hid the scroll inside the spine of an old, discarded ledger about barley taxation. No one had touched it in years, no one would now. His words would rest there, pressed like a dried flower, long after the breath that wrote them had faded. Enlila, too, returned to her daily rhythm, each movement sharp and purposeful. She stopped speaking to the brewer's son who had once lingered too long by her stall. She sold her goods without small talk. She wrapped her dates in rush leaves, not cloth, so no one could accuse her of hiding anything. And though her hands worked as swiftly as ever, her heart pulsed with a strange combination of caution and quiet defiance. She was not ashamed, but she was alert. One afternoon, while she was cleaning her scales, a boy approached her stall, no older than 12, with soot on his cheeks and a scroll in his hand. "For you," he said, without meeting her eyes. "From the temple." She didn't touch it immediately. She waited until the boy was out of sight, then unrolled it slowly, careful not to crease the parchment. It was not from Dagan. The letter bore the seal of the overseer, a stylized pair of eyes flanked by palm branches. The message was brief. "You are hereby summoned for questioning regarding recent activities near temple grounds. Appear at dusk, come alone, speak truly." There was no accusation, no mention of names, but it was clear. The net had begun to tighten. That evening, she arrived, just as the sun dipped low, casting a red glow across the temple's upper steps. The guards at the entrance nodded, said nothing, let her pass. The air inside was cooler than she expected, heavy with incense and shadow. She was led to a side chamber, not the formal hall, and asked to sit on a cushion before a low table. The overseer entered alone, unarmored, unarmed, but carrying the weight of his title like a weapon. He did not greet her. He unrolled a tablet and read a single passage aloud. "If a man of temple station enters into union with a woman of the market without right or witness, both shall be judged." Then he looked at her, his face unreadable. "You may speak." Enlila did not flinch. "I have done no wrong." His eyes narrowed slightly. No wrongdoing is not the same as no secrecy. "I sell goods. I pay tithe. I follow the path of my family." "Do you know the scribe Dagan?" A pause, just long enough to become meaningful. "I know his face. He buys from many vendors." "Do you know his walk?" Enlila tilted her head, a faint smile forming at the corner of her mouth. Not amusement, but resignation. "Babylon is small. We all know each other's walk." The overseer stared for a moment longer, then nodded. "You are dismissed. But do not misunderstand, this is not the end." As she rose, she said softly, "It never began." She left the temple with her spine straight, her breath steady, but inside something twisted. She had told no lies. But the truth had its own shape, its own burden. She had walked through the eye of the storm untouched, for now. Dagan found out the next day. A whisper from a sympathetic priest, a rumor that the woman from the market had been summoned. He understood immediately. And for the first time, Panic scratched at the edges of his calm. He wanted to see her, to speak, to plan. But it was too risky. Every move now had the weight of consequence. So he did the only thing he could. He returned to the western wall after midnight, torch in hand, and carved a single mark into the plaster with a broken shard of pottery. Not words, just a symbol. Two figures standing back to back, their arms raised, separated by a vertical line. The next morning, Enlila passed by and saw it. She stopped for less than a heartbeat, brushed the mark gently with her fingers, and kept walking. No message, no reply, just acknowledgement. It was enough. And so the story continued, not with declarations or escapes, but with stillness, with symbols, with the quiet defiance of two people who refused to let the law name them fully. The code would not forget, but neither would they. There is something ancient in the way the city breathes after sunset. Babylon, for all its glory and clamor, softens in the dark. The hammering of bronze quiets, the cries of merchants fade into murmurs, and even the ziggurat seems to exhale beneath its crown of stars. In these hours, laws lose their voices, scribes stop writing, guards lean against walls with eyes half closed, and somewhere in that stillness between the falling hush of night and the memory of sun-baked stone, unspoken truths stir, like birds unsettled in their roost. Dagan no longer hoped for comfort. He understood now that comfort belonged to those who fit neatly into their prescribed slots. Sons who married as their fathers instructed, scribes who copied codes without questioning the meanings underneath. His comfort had ended the moment he'd looked too long at Enlila's hands as they arranged bundles of figs. The moment his pen had hovered, uncertain, above a line of Hammurabi's statutes that spoke not of justice, but of ownership. But even in discomfort, there was clarity. In the silence that followed the temple's inquiry into Enlila, Dagan found no safety, but he did find understanding. Babylon wasn't angry, not yet. The city, like its gods, moved slowly, not in haste, but with certainty. It didn't strike quickly, it watched, it waited. And when it chose to act, it did so with the indifference of stone collapsing under its own weight. Dagan felt that weight now, not from guilt, but from inevitability. So he returned to his scroll. Not the temple scrolls, not the coded rituals he copied for the priests, but his own, the hidden one, bound with linen string and tucked inside a hollowed reed jar behind the archives. On its brittle pages he wrote not laws but fragments of feeling. His handwriting grew less formal, more human, more like speech than record. I do not regret the danger, I regret only the times I called it silence, when it was already shouting in our hearts. He no longer wrote her name. That would be too dangerous, even in secrecy. But the shape of her was in every line, the warmth of her eyes, the weight of her breath when she stood too close, the way her presence made the rest of Babylon seem like background noise, statues and walls pretending to matter. Outside, the rains began, not heavy, not storming, just the slow, persistent drizzle that softened the dust and turned alleyways into streams. It was a cleansing of sorts. A temporary pause in the heat, a moment when even the scribes allowed themselves longer breaks, when the smell of wet clay filled the air and the palm trees glistened under low grey skies. Enlila welcomed the rain. She had always loved it, not just for its coolness, but for its mask. Rain made the streets blur. It kept the nosy indoors. It made everyone look down at their feet, preoccupied with stepping over puddles. Under rain, even the most suspicious eyes looked away. It was on one such morning that she made her first true decision. She rose earlier than usual before the sky had fully lightened. and wrapped her shawl tightly around her. She left her stall closed, the hanging cloth untouched, the baskets of dates sealed under lids of palm fibre. She carried nothing but a small clay jug and a cloth-wrapped bundle under her arm. She walked not toward the market, but toward the southern edge of the temple compound, to the weavers' quarters, a part of the grounds rarely watched, used mostly by older women and the occasional apprentice mender. It wasn't forbidden, but it was unlikely, unexpected, and therefore useful. There, beneath the overhang of the dying tent, she left the bundle. Inside it was a single tablet, baked and unmarked on the outside, with a symbol carved into its base, a reed and a bird, her old childhood signature. Not her name, but enough for him to know. The tablet's message was short, barely more than a whisper. If the storm comes, let it find us honest. I will not run, but I will not bow. She didn't wait. She didn't linger. She turned and walked back through the rain-soaked alleys, her shawl dripping, her heart strangely light. She knew the risk. She didn't care, or rather, she cared too much not to risk it. That night, Dagan found it. A young apprentice brought it to the scriptorium thinking it misplaced. Someone dropped this near the dye tent, he said, shrugging. Looks old. Dagan took it with steady hands and thanked him. He waited until the boy had gone, then turned the tablet over and saw the mark. His breath caught, not in panic, but in something that felt like reverence. He read the words once, twice, then again. They were not poetic, not dramatic, but they were her. Every letter carved with calm resolve. It wasn't a message of farewell, it wasn't a plea. It was a choice, and it demanded a choice in return. That evening, Dagan did something he had not done in weeks. He walked into the main temple hall during the quiet hour, when the outer priests had withdrawn and the inner sanctum glowed with dim lamps. He stood before the statue of Shamash, the sun god and judge of men, and laid down a small dish of dates, not for the god, for memory. Then he bowed, not deeply, not ceremonially, but simply, and walked out. He left the compound without permission. He turned away from the usual path. He didn't disguise his face. He didn't hide in shadows. He walked to the market quarter with the rain still damp on the stones, and when he saw her just closing her stall, he stopped. She looked up. For a moment, the world froze. Not in fear, not in romance, but in the simple stillness of two people who had chosen not to lie. He stepped forward. So did she. No one else watched. Or if they did, they said nothing. He didn't touch her, he didn't speak. He just stood there with her for the length of a breath that neither wanted to release. Then quietly, he said, "They will come." She nodded. "Let them." He smiled, a tired, worn smile that carried months of silence. Then they parted again. But something had changed. Not the law, not the eyes that watched, not the cold weight of the code that waited to inscribe their names among the judged. What had changed was them. They had stood in the open, if only for a moment. And in a city that prized secrecy and silence, that alone was defiance. And so the story continued, not with drama, not with fire, but with rain-soaked earth, with unread tablets, with hearts that no longer flinched at truth. Babylon still watched. But now, they watched back. There is a rhythm to cities, even ancient ones, especially ancient ones. A rhythm older than drums, deeper than chants, woven into the way feet wear paths into stone, the way bread rises and cools each morning, the way gossip flows like river water into every open ear. Babylon's rhythm was slow, dignified, stern. It did not change easily. And so when something did change, even slightly, the city noticed. It didn't shout, it didn't accuse, it simply adjusted, like a reed basket reshaping itself around an unfamiliar weight. That unfamiliar weight now was Dagan and Enlila, no longer hiding, not exactly, but not yet declared, not named, not condemned, simply present, too quiet to be scandalous, too steady to be dismissed. A discomfort not loud enough to be punished, but persistent enough to draw glances. In the days that followed their quiet meeting in the rain, something delicate settled between them. Not relief, for nothing was resolved. Not joy, for joy required safety. But something more ancient, the peace of being seen and not disavowed, of knowing that whatever the city might say, they had chosen together to no longer pretend they hadn't. They didn't walk together openly, they didn't speak in the streets. But when Dagan crossed the courtyard at midday, he no longer angled his body away from the market wall. When Enlila finished selling her wares, she no longer hurried to close her stall at the sight of temple robes. These were not grand gestures, they were not even defiant. But in a city ruled by appearances, even stillness could be subversion. Still, silence had its cost. The overseer, methodical as ever, marked the lack of movement not as a retreat, but as confirmation. He was not a man to be distracted by the absence of evidence. In Babylon, silence was never emptiness, it was intention. And so, without word or fanfare, he summoned Ishbi-Addu and handed him a new scroll. Not a report, but a directive. Observe, do not interfere, they will reveal themselves. The scroll contained a schedule. Dagan's duties were to be rotated, shifted into proximity with temple maidens, relocated to rituals that passed through the city's central market square. Subtle pressures, strategic placements, not traps exactly, but invitations to air. Enlila too felt the shift. Suddenly her tax collector came earlier than usual, inspecting her goods more thoroughly. A new stall was opened beside hers, a young woman with dried fish, and a penchant for loud, unnecessary conversation. Questions were asked too casually. How long have you been alone? Is that temple boy your cousin? She answered each one with a nod, a shrug, a half smile. She spoke less, moved more. And at night, she wrote nothing. She burned no oil. She simply lay beneath her woven mat, eyes open to the dark, listening to the drip of water from the roof and the slow, careful breath of the city deciding her fate. Dagan, in turn, grew quieter. He completed every task. His scrolls were flawless, his readings precise. But those who knew him, or thought they did, began to notice something was missing. The small jokes he used to mutter while copying prayers, the questions he used to ask about the order of constellations, the way his shoulders once relaxed slightly when surrounded by his fellow apprentices. All gone. He became the perfect scribe, and the most dangerous kind, the one who had something to protect. Only one person dared say anything directly. Her name was Ninsatu, a senior scribe and the daughter of a priestess. She had seen Babylon eat its own before. She pulled Dagan aside one afternoon under the pretense of reviewing a translation error and said quietly, "They are waiting for you to speak first." Dagan said nothing. She continued, "They won't punish a silence, not until it becomes a noise." He met her eyes. "And if it already is?" She didn't smile. "Then speak carefully." That night he returned to his scroll, his private one. He didn't write a poem, he didn't write a plan, he simply wrote one sentence. "I am no longer afraid, but I'm no longer safe." He folded it, sealed it, and tucked it into the sleeve of his robe. He didn't know what he meant to do with it, but he needed it near. Across the city, Enlila sat beside her oil jar, fingers absently tracing the rim. She had not sold much that day. The clouds had hung too low and most people had stayed in. Still, the new stall beside her had done brisk business. The loud girl with the dried fish was popular, chatty, always smiling. Enlila had smiled too when required. But each smile had been a thread pulled from an unravelling cloth. And yet, the sky that night was impossibly clear. The clouds had rolled westward, leaving behind a canvas of stars so crisp and bright they looked etched into the heavens. From her doorway, Enlila could see the ziggurat lit faintly by torchlight, a silhouette of stone against a velvet dome. And for a moment, she let herself imagine, just briefly, that this city might forgive her, that its walls might grow weary of judgment, that its gods might one day look away. She did not believe it, but she allowed herself the image. And then she heard it. A single knock, soft, deliberate, on the side of her stall, not the front, the side wall where she stored her baskets, the wall no one approached. She rose, heart steady but fast, and opened the cloth flap. He stood there, hooded, his eyes catching the faint orange of the nearest brazier. He said nothing, he didn't have to. She stepped aside. Inside they didn't speak, not at first. He sat cross-legged on the mat, removed the scroll from his sleeve, and placed it between them. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she said, "You shouldn't have come." "I know." "Then why?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because I wanted to remember what truth sounded like." Her breath caught. And then, just like that, she laughed. It was small, restrained, almost sad, but it was real. The first sound in days that hadn't been measured, masked, or shaped to fit a mold. She picked up the scroll, unrolled it, and read the single line. Then she folded it again and tucked it under her mat. "You should leave before the guards change." He nodded. But he didn't move, and neither did she. For a long time, they sat there in the warmth of a flickering oil lamp, surrounded by baskets of unsold fruit, and the hum of a city that no longer cared if it was right, only if it was obeyed. They didn't speak again, because sometimes silence, the real kind, the kind made of presence and breath and knowing, is stronger than any word. Outside, Babylon waited, but for now, inside one quiet stall, two people remembered what it meant to be human. The next morning arrived like it always did, with the slow stretch of light creeping down sandstone walls and the first carts groaning across the market square. But beneath that familiar rhythm, something had shifted. The city still bustled, still blinked itself awake with the same routine gestures, but it carried now a tension that didn't belong to wind or weather. Babylon, once merely watching, had begun to remember. And memory, in cities like this, is never passive. It is clay baked hard by repetition, and once etched, it endures. In the small stall tucked between the fishmonger and the oil seller, Enlila resumed her routine. Her hands moved with quiet precision, arranging her wares, weighing fruit, responding to customers with the same economy of speech that had always been her way. But her thoughts drifted elsewhere, toward a scroll hidden beneath her mat, toward a knock on her wall that had carried more meaning than any decree, and toward a boy, not quite a man, but something far more dangerous, who had entered her space without asking for redemption, only presence. And still, she did not falter. To falter would be to draw notice. And notice, in Babylon, was the prelude to punishment. Dagan too had returned to his duties with measured calm. But behind his practiced script, behind the precise angles of his cuneiform, lay something harder to contain. Not defiance exactly, but resolve. Not the grand kind, not the kind that burned cities or shouted in plazas. Number this was quieter. The resolve of breath held a second longer than needed, of eyes meeting another's without apology, of knowing that the worst might come and still choosing not to unlove what had been felt. But Babylon had its own heartbeat, and it had begun to drum. The temple priests did not speak aloud of what they knew or suspected, but scrolls were quietly requested from the record keepers. Schedules were reviewed, names were not spoken, but initials were underlined. Even Ninsatu, the sympathetic scribe, had begun to keep her distance, her gaze wary, as if fearful that a glance might bind her to a fate she hadn't chosen. And yet in that thickening silence, Dagan found something unexpected. Clarity. He had expected fear, he had prepared for it, but what came instead was a strange, steady peace. Because now, finally, the lies were gone. There was nothing left to pretend. Every word he had written, every quiet walk past the stall, every sleepless night, it was all real. And if punishment came, it would come for the truth, not for a shadow of it. One evening, as dusk crept across the city like an old cat curling into corners, Dagan was summoned again, not to be questioned, but to assist in a ceremonial reading for the outer courtyard. It was nothing unusual. A minor rite, a seasonal petition for river calm and crop balance. But the timing was clear. It placed him directly in view of the main thoroughfare, the very road Enlila walked each day to collect her evening bread from the baker. He saw it for what it was, a spectacle staged for benefit of someone else's gaze. Still he went. He wore his robes, he read the lines from the stone tablet, he stood beneath the painted canopy and let the incense sting his eyes. And when Enlila passed, her basket empty, her step steady, he did not falter. Their eyes met for less than a heartbeat, but in that blink, an entire lifetime passed. Later that night, as the streets emptied and the ziggurat lights flickered low, Enlila sat by her stall and found her hands trembling, not from fear, from decision. It had become clear that Babylon was not content to wait. The net would tighten, the law would be spoken, and if she remained still, the choice would be made for her. So she made hers. She would write, not to the temple, not to Dagan, but to the one place where truth, even in Babylon, was allowed to breathe, the court of the silent stone. It was an ancient custom, older than Hammurabi's code, older than the current ziggurat itself. A tradition born from the early days when cities were still young and gods were still uncertain. Any citizen, regardless of status, could submit a clay tablet to the court of the silent stone, a chamber buried beneath the temple, where no judgment was passed and no reply ever given. The tablet would be sealed, stored, and never read. It was a place for truth too fragile to live in the open, and too sacred to be lost. She shaped her clay that night with trembling fingers. She pressed each character slowly, pausing between lines to breathe. He did not promise me eternity, only honesty. And in this world, that is more rare than gold. She signed it with no name, only the old mark, reed and bird. At dawn, she wrapped it in palm fiber and handed it to a passing acolyte. "For the silent court," she said, simply. The boy nodded, used to such things. And then she returned to her stall and waited. For what, she wasn't sure. Not for rescue, not even for justice, just for what would come next. And what came was not a guard, not a summons, not even a whisper. What came was Dagan, not at her stall, not in secret, not in haste. He came as a man who had already been judged, not by others, but by his own spirit, and found peace in the verdict. He came carrying nothing but a single dried fig, wrapped in linen, and placed it on her counter. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She placed a small reed beside it. A thank you. And he turned and walked away. No words, no plan, no pretense. Just two people who had refused to be erased, even as the city prepared to close its pages, and behind them, unseen, the temple chamber of the silent stone accepted another tablet into its darkness. One more truth buried where no eyes could ever judge it. Babylon watched and waited. The fig sat on Enlila's counter for nearly the entire morning, wrapped neatly in its linen, as if untouched by hand. She didn't move it, didn't sell it, didn't eat it. It lay there like a secret wearing a disguise, familiar to the unspoken few and invisible to the rest. A fig, ordinary in every way, but wrapped by him, placed by him, and for her, it pulsed with the quiet gravity of a vow. The reed she had placed beside it remained until the sun was directly overhead. When the heat curled the linen and the stool's shade shortened to a sliver, Enlila finally took both, the fig and the reed, and tucked them into the folds of her sash. No one asked about it. No one needed to. In Babylon, discretion wasn't taught. It was inherited. You either grew into silence or were swallowed by it. Across the temple compound, Dagan continued his work in precise order. He copied the seasonal records, catalogued the offerings, and assisted the priests during the midday chant to Ninurta. On the surface, he was impeccable. But below that practiced calm, a tension brewed, not from guilt, not from fear, but from the awareness that the end of stillness was near. The city had grown too quiet. Too much silence was never safe. It was late in the afternoon when the shift came, small, subtle, like the first breath of wind before a desert storm. A summons arrived for Dagan, carried by a temple boy with bare feet and frightened eyes. The seal on the wax was the overseer's, simple, heavy, final. The boy didn't speak as he handed it over. Dagan didn't ask questions. He knew where to go. The inner chamber was not grand. It was not lined in gold, nor filled with incense or hymns. It was a stone room with little more than a bench and a pair of narrow windows carved high into the walls. The light filtered in like the memory of daylight, thin, reluctant. The overseer was already there. He didn't look up as Dagan entered. Instead, he gestured toward a scroll resting on the bench. "You've been seen," he said without preamble. "You've been quiet, but that only delays things. It never erases them." Dagan stood still. The overseer continued. "There are no formal charges yet. Not because you're innocent, but because proving guilt requires more effort than some are willing to expend. For now." He finally looked up. "Tell me, Dagan, what do you believe law is for?" The question surprised him. Not the words, but the tone. It wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't mocking. It was tired. Dagan hesitated. "To keep the city from breaking." The overseer nodded. "Yes, exactly. Law is not for fairness. It's not for mercy. It's for balance. We are stone placed upon stone. If one shifts too much, the whole wall falls." He tapped the scroll. "This city has survived because people know their place, because they do what's expected, because they follow rules, even when they don't agree with them." Dagan said nothing. The overseer's eyes narrowed. "You think you're different. You think your quiet is a shield." He stood then, slowly, crossing to the window and staring out. "She has done nothing loud. Neither have you. But the silence around you is beginning to hum." Dagan felt it. The verdict hiding inside a speech. Then the overseer turned and said, not cruelly, but with the coldness of inevitability, "You will be reassigned to Murray." Dagan blinked. "That's 3 days downriver." "Yes," the overseer said. "You'll join the temple scribes there. They've asked for a translator. You are qualified. It's an honorable transfer." Dagan stepped forward. "And her?" The overseer's mouth tightened. "She will remain. She is not of the temple. She is not your burden." Dagan shook his head. "She is not a burden." "No," the overseer said quietly. "She is your mirror." The silence that followed stretched longer than comfort allowed. Then the overseer walked past him, pausing only to say, "You leave at first light." And just like that, it was done. No punishment, no chains, no public shaming, just removal, distance, disassembly by bureaucracy. And yet it was exile just the same. That night, Dagan returned to his quarters and sat before his scroll, the one that held all the thoughts he dared not say aloud. He read through the lines written over weeks, fragments of memory, poems carved in panic, moments of joy flattened into tablets. And at the bottom of the last page, he added only this: "I will not leave her behind, even if I must leave her here." Then carefully, he tore the page away. At the market, Enlila felt the change before she was told, a breeze too cold for summer, a hush that spread before words. She saw the temple boy hurrying past with empty hands. She saw the guard posted an hour early near the courtyard, and she saw the dried fig, returned that morning, not on her counter, but placed on the stone ledge beside the old well. She didn't open it. She didn't have to. She knew what parting looked like. She waited until dusk, then walked slowly to the edge of the river. The same river that had, for generations, carried grain, blood, hope, and exile. She sat there, watching the water shift, and whispered softly, "Let the current carry his name, but not take him from me." The next morning, she stood at her stall, calm and dry-eyed, as the caravan prepared to leave. She didn't walk to the gates, she didn't wave, but she stood still, facing the road, and Dagan, perched atop a cart of temple scrolls, turned once. Not enough for the guards to notice, just enough to see her standing there, just enough to remember her like that, not weeping, not begging, but enduring, like Babylon itself. He didn't look back again. And Enlila didn't move until the dust of the caravan had settled into the earth. She then reached into her sash, pulled out the fig he'd returned, and placed it gently on her stall counter. Beside it, a reed, and beneath them both, a whisper the city could not hear. He is gone, but not lost. In Babylon, absence was not merely a space unfilled, it was a presence of its own. People remembered through routines, through glances toward places now unoccupied. A stall left closed too many days was not seen as abandoned, but haunted. A silence repeated enough became a chant. And so when Dagan left with the temple caravan bound for Murray, his absence was not empty. It echoed, it hummed beneath the market's chatter, behind the chants of the temple priests, in the quiet brush of a reed pen on wet clay. Enlila felt it most acutely in the spaces where he had never actually been. Not in her storeroom or beside her hearth, but in the emptiness between stalls, in the sound of clay jars settling after dusk, in the stillness of her fingers when she forgot for a moment what they were supposed to do. She didn't collapse, she didn't cry. There was no one to hold her, no warm shoulder to lean into, no kind voice to whisper reassurances. She didn't want them. What she had with him had never been about comfort. It had been about presence. And now, in his absence, she performed the strange act of remembering him while continuing to live, not mourning, not pausing, just enduring. And Babylon, as ever, watched without comment. In the days that followed his departure, Enlila resumed her trade. Her stall remained the same, baskets of dried fruit, modest clay weights, scales of bronze too old for precision. The girl with the dried fish beside her still spoke loudly, still smiled too often, still leaned over just slightly whenever a temple scribe passed. And Enlila still replied to her questions with simple nods or short phrases. But inside, her rhythm had shifted. Each morning she rose before the sun and lit a single oil lamp, not because she needed the light, but because it reminded her of something they had shared: stillness. In that fragile hour between sleep and sunrise, she would place her hands on the smooth surface of her clay jars and trace the shapes of letters she did not write, a name never spoken, a promise never made aloud. She did not expect his return. She had lived too long in Babylon to cling to such things. She knew how far Mari was, how slow the caravans travelled, how heavy the code weighed on those who served it. She also knew that love, however sacred, was not armor. It did not grant immunity. It could not rewind what had been decided, but still she remembered. And in remembering, she refused to forget. She began collecting fragments, not letters, not tokens. Those were too obvious. Instead, she began saving pieces of her day that felt like him. A leaf folded by the wind and caught in her stall's awning. A scrap of parchment bearing a half-erased line of poetry. A broken fig stem shaped like the symbol for again. She placed these in a jar at the back of her room. No one saw, no one asked. To others, it was just storage. To her, it was memory. Far downriver, in the city of Mari, Dagan moved like a man underwater. The temple compound there was smaller, more practical, lacking the grandeur of Babylon, but rich in silence. The scribes worked diligently, but there was less ceremony, fewer prayers, more records, fewer rituals. It should have suited him. It didn't. Each morning he rose, washed, and recited his duties. He copied legal disputes, catalogued trade agreements, translated grain weights from Sumerian into Akkadian. His scrolls were praised for clarity, his demeanor for discipline. But those who worked with him, those who had eyes for more than ink, noticed the weight in his shoulders, the way he lingered at the edge of conversations but never entered, the way he paused sometimes before finishing a line of text, as if hearing another voice far away. He did not write to her. There were no messages, no scrolls smuggled upriver, no secret marks left for couriers. To do so would be to endanger her, to invite attention, to stain her with implication. Instead, he did what he could. He carved. Late at night, after the temple was still, he shaped small objects out of clay and stone. Simple things, a river curve, a fig leaf, a symbol for wind. He etched lines in old tiles. Not full letters, just fragments, enough for meaning, too little for translation. He buried these in the earth outside the scriptorium wall. A foolish act, perhaps, but sacred. And in this way they remained together, not through letters or words, but through habits, through rituals, through the tiny, untraceable gestures that made love real without needing anyone else's permission. Back in Babylon, Enlila began to notice a change in the city. The overseer no longer sent watchers. The loud girl with the dried fish was reassigned to a different corner. The tax collector's visits became routine again. The market seemed to exhale. The danger for now had passed. But what remained was not peace. It was pause, as though the city, having struck its blow, now waited to see what would grow in the silence. Enlila made no announcement. She didn't withdraw, but she did begin something new. She offered small tokens at her stall, not for sale, but as gifts. A fig wrapped in leaf, a reed etched with a line of poetry, a smooth stone inked with a symbol for journey. When asked why, she would smile softly and say, to remember those who travel. Some merchants laughed. Some looked puzzled. A few, the older ones, said nothing, only nodded. And in the quiet corners of the temple, the overseer received word. "She's stable," his informant said. "Quiet." No more signs. The overseer did not reply. He only gazed out the window at the slowly baking horizon. Because even he, who had served the code longer than most had lived, knew that love, once spoken into the air, never truly disappeared. It might lie dormant, it might wear silence like a veil, but it endured, and cities, no matter how old, always remembered the shape of such things. And so the weeks passed, and the seasons shifted, and still they lived, apart but not undone. She woke each morning and lit her lamp. He carved each night and buried memory in clay. And though they did not touch and though they did not speak, somewhere in the unseen breath between their actions, something remained, something no code could erase. The lamp still burned each morning. It had become her ritual now, not because it brought light, but because it marked time. A quiet protest against forgetting. Each flicker, each spill of oil down the side of the ceramic dish was a reminder that memory could be deliberate. That absence did not have to mean abandonment, that there was still between herself and the world that watched, a small circle she could keep sacred. The neighbors no longer asked about Dagan. Time had done its gentle erasure, blunting the edges of curiosity. He had been reassigned after all. That was the official word. A necessary transfer. No disgrace, no scandal, just movement. And in Babylon, people moved often, not always willingly, but always quietly. Enlila said nothing. She never corrected their assumptions. She let their forgetfulness build its shelter over her truth. But at night, when the stalls closed and the moon traced its soft fingers across the rooftops, she sat with her palms open and her eyes fixed not on the stars, but on the clay jar tucked beside her bed, the one filled not with objects, but with symbols, a broken fig stem, a sliver of parchment, a single dried reed. She didn't think of it as waiting. That would have implied expectation. And she had long let go of that. What she held now was different. It was witnessing, honoring, a steady tending of what remained without asking it to become more than it could. Sometimes she whispered his name. Not for calling, not for prayer, but the way one might recite a word to keep its shape from eroding. Softly, like breath. And afterward, she would go to sleep beneath her woven mat, knowing that the world might never shift for her, but that she had not surrendered. Far to the north, the city of Mari baked in its own rhythm, less grand, more direct. Dagan had grown used to its flatter cadence. The people were brisk, the laws clearer, there was less ceremony, more trade. The scribes here recorded grain tallies and water disputes, not divine lineage or omens in flight patterns. It was work without poetry. And yet, he wrote, not for them, for himself. Each night, after his formal duties, he pulled a worn slate from beneath his sleeping cot and inscribed single lines. Not sentences, not full thoughts, just impressions. A scent, a shape, a sound, a memory pressed gently into clay. The sound of dried figs cracking in the hand. The curve of a reed in wind. The look of someone who has learned to endure. He never named her. Never included dates. But the meaning was whole. He shaped each tablet carefully, then hid it. Not buried this time, but placed along the outer wall of the scriptorium garden, where the ivy was thick and the air smelled faintly of myrrh. There, among the trailing vines and cracked stone, his memories waited, untouched. Others had noticed his quiet practice. One older scribe, a woman named Tadu, paused beside him once while he worked. "What do you make each night, Templeman?" "Practice," he had said. She raised an eyebrow. "That's not practice. That's mourning." "Aye," he smiled softly, not denying it. "Better to write what's true than what's permitted," she added. Then she left. He watched her go and felt something stir. Not hope, not sadness, but the comfort of being seen. Even briefly. One evening, after the market had closed early for a holy day, he sat with the last light brushing his fingertips and wrote not a fragment, but a full passage. "If I am ever remembered, let it be by the shape of the things I left behind, the way silence can carry feeling, the way a name can become a ritual, the way love, unnamed, still insists on returning." He pressed the tablet gently, then placed it beside the others. And that night, as the stars rose above the flat roofs of Marie, a faint wind passed through the garden, lifting the ivy and brushing the tablets with a whisper of breath. Back in Babylon, the season began to change. The air grew heavier, sweeter. The dates ripened early. And in the temple, the priests began preparations for the equinox festival, the one that celebrated balance between darkness and light, between chaos and order. A perfect irony, Enlila thought, for a city that feared imbalance more than injustice. She knew the festival well. It brought travelers, opened roads, and most importantly, loosened rules. For 3 days, scrutiny softened, watchers were distracted, offerings flowed like wine. And it was during this season, every year, that the court of the Silent Stone received more tablets than at any other time. She wrote again. This time, not a lament, a promise. "Even if you never return, you have not vanished. What we were, we still are, in the way I touch the morning, in the way I arrange my stall, in the way I remember joy without needing permission." She sealed the tablet in wax, not for secrecy, but for reverence. She handed it to a boy who carried such offerings daily, and when he looked at her, curious, she said simply, "It belongs to memory." He bowed slightly and left. The temple received it. The chamber beneath, the silent stone room, took it as it did all things, without judgment. It was said the gods never read what was placed there, that it belonged to the world before law, to the part of the soul that needed to speak without reply. She believed that, and that night she slept more deeply than she had in weeks. Across the water in Marie, Dagan dreamed, not of her face, for dreams rarely remember faces, but of sound, the rustle of fruit skins, the whisper of dried leaves, the word "if" etched into stone. And in that dream, he was not gone. He was present, not returned, but never lost. It shifted direction just slightly, brushing against rooftops from the north rather than the east, and with it came scents that hadn't passed through the city in weeks. Fresh-cut cedar from the upper rivers, incense from traders moving toward Akkad, and the faint musk of river clay newly disturbed by the oxen pulling carts too heavy for silence. To most, it was the sign of late summer approaching, a season of slowed steps, of thick air, of trade routes narrowing before the flood time. To Enlila, it was the smell of time folding. She felt it in the ache of her knees when she crouched too long beside her wares, in the way her fingers moved more automatically now when tying bundles of dates, and most of all, in the way her thoughts arrived more softly, like footprints in damp earth. The sharpness of Dagan's departure had dulled, not disappeared, never that, but softened, rounded by repetition, wrapped in her daily rituals like linen around a jar. And that was what he had become, not an absence, but a rhythm. Every morning she still lit the lamp. She still opened her stall with the same 3 gestures: sweep, lift, high, she still offered her small gifts, a stone, a dried stem, a carved line of poetry, to the customers who asked nothing but accepted everything. And the jar beside her bed, filled with fragments, had grown heavier. Not with grief, with continuity. Sometimes she wondered if this was what it meant to carry someone, not through declarations or longing, but through motion. Through not letting the world turn without the echo of who you loved inside your breath. Far away, Dagan was doing the same. Mari had settled around him like sand settling after flood. The people had stopped watching him so closely. He had become familiar, if not quite known. And his work, recording trade exchanges and border disputes, had become steady enough to offer spare hours. In those hours, he carved. The garden wall where he hid his memory tablets was now nearly full. He never placed them randomly, each had its place, arranged like sentences. And sometimes, when the light was low and no one passed nearby, he would sit with his back to the ivy-covered stone and whisper the meaning of each in sequence, as if reading aloud a story that only he could see. He didn't need to explain it to anyone. The story was not for others, but there were moments, brief, unmistakable, when the lines between absence and presence blurred. A shape in the market crowd reminded him of how she tied her sash. The scent of roasted barley made him remember the crackle of her voice when she laughed. And once, passing a pool left by rain, he saw a reed floating in its center and felt the breath leave him, not in pain, but in recognition. That night, he carved a new piece. Memory is not the shadow of what was. It is the breath of what still is, even when we stop naming it. He placed it high on the wall, where the ivy curled most densely. He was not alone in his remembering. Back in Babylon, the temple courtyard grew more festive with each passing week. The equinox festival had lingered in the city's rhythm longer than usual, and its aftertaste brought a kind of loosened ease. The priests smiled more, the guards leaned on their spears less tightly. Even the overseer, though still solemn, seemed less poised for punishment. It was during this gentle lull that something unusual happened. A merchant from Mari arrived, a grain seller with a limp and a tongue slick with story. He set up beside the dried fruit stalls, and when he introduced himself to Enlila, his accent was unmistakable. "You trade with Mari often?" she asked, casual. "Only the good parts," he replied with a grin. "The temple there feeds its scribes better than most generals feed their men." She smiled politely, but something behind her eyes sparked. Over the next few days, she listened, not always directly. Sometimes she simply kept her stall open longer than usual. Sometimes she asked for change she didn't need, but she listened. And then on the fourth day, she asked, "Do you ever visit the scriptorium?" The man nodded. "Deliver to their stores sometimes. Scrolls, seals, ink. And do they plant anything near their walls? Vines?" He blinked. "Ivy, half the wall's covered with it. Don't know why, it grows wild, never dries." She looked down at her hands, and her breath caught. She didn't ask anything else. She didn't need to, because ivy didn't grow in Mari naturally. It was too warm, too dry. But it could be coaxed if someone tended it. If someone planted it deliberately. If someone wanted to make a garden not for beauty, but for concealment. That evening, she didn't light the lamp. Instead, she sat in darkness, listening to the silence around her and letting the image bloom inside her mind. Of a wall, of vines, of clay, tucked between roots like offerings. She imagined him sitting there, carving. She imagined him placing each piece with care. And for the first time in many nights, she felt not longing but presence. He had not forgotten. He had never tried to. The next morning she wrapped a single dried fig in linen and pressed a reed through the knot. She didn't place it on the stall. She carried it to the temple, not to the altar, not to the court, but to the quietest corner of the garden where the sun barely reached. She dug a small hollow in the earth, and there, beneath palm shade and silence, she buried it. Not for him to find, but for the space between them to hold. Love, she had learned, was not about proximity. It was about permission and to remember to continue, to let the world move without leaving you behind. And so she did. The fig softened in the soil, the reed bent, and above them Babylon continued to breathe, slow and ancient and unknowing. But in the still places, in the cracks beneath the stone, something endured, not loudly, not in defiance, but with gentleness. And that was enough. When a river runs long enough, its banks stop remembering the rains that began it. The city of Babylon was like that river now, slow, wide, and unmoved by individual drops. Dagan had been gone many moons, and still the walls stood, still the stalls bustled, still the ziggurat cast its morning shadow like a monument to eternity. And yet, deep in the silt of things unspoken, something had begun to grow. Enlila walked the same path every morning. Down the side alley past the copper cellar, across the dusty thoroughfare, and into the shaded mouth of the market square. She no longer quickened her pace at the sight of temple colours, no longer adjusted her posture when guards lingered too long. What had once been vigilance had become routine, not resignation, but quiet integration. The city, like any vast organism, eventually forgot how to tense against what had not moved in moons. But she had not forgotten. In the quiet hour before dawn, when her hands were free and the air still clung to last night's cool, she would sit with the clay jar of fragments beside her and choose just one. That morning, it was a loop of twine knotted not at the center, but near the edge. Something she'd once tied around a bundle of dried figs the week Dagan had last stood near her stall. It meant nothing to others. To her, it meant placement, nearness. The way a knot off-center still held a bundle together. She held it a while, then placed it back among the rest. Outside, the day stirred. Pigeons pecked near the drainage stones. The boy who sold sesame cakes shouted too early, his voice cracking in the cold air. A woman laughed, the loud girl with the dried fish back again, her trade now olives. Things moved, things changed, but her ritual remained. Far away, Dagan rose before the temple bells in Mari and sat beside the garden wall. The ivy had thickened. It now obscured the lowest tablets, the ones he had placed in those early weeks when memory felt raw and brittle. Now the green covered them like a hand over a wound, not to deny it, but to protect it while it healed. He carved less now, but with greater care. He had begun to write in spirals, not lines, a circle that curved inward, the words coiling like a fig's core. He didn't know why, perhaps because time felt that way. Not a line pulling forward, but a loop folding back on itself, bringing him always, inevitably, to her. That morning's spiral read, "You are the center of a quiet I never knew I carried. Every silence since has bent itself around your shape." He pressed the last word into clay, let it dry, and placed it carefully in the upper crook of the wall, where the vines parted just enough to cradle it. The old scribe, Tadu, passed by later and glanced at his handiwork. "You still building a temple for ghosts?" she asked, not unkindly. "Not ghosts," he said. "Then what?" He looked up. "The part of love that doesn't ask to be named." She gave a quiet grunt and left. In Babylon, Enlila prepared for the slow season. As the river's flood approached, merchants began to pack early. Trade would pause, the streets would grow muddy, and carts would bog down. Even the temple grew quieter during flood watch. Fewer ceremonies, fewer travelers. And yet this year there was no ache in the pause. There was instead a fullness. She began writing again. Not messages, not secrets, just fragments. She pressed them into clay the size of her palm and buried them at the base of the fig tree near the rear wall of the temple. The one that hadn't borne fruit in years. She didn't expect it to. She wasn't asking for signs, but it was her space now, her way of making presence physical. One such tablet read, "You never left. You simply stopped needing to be visible to remain." And another, "If this city forgets us, let the roots remember." She buried each gently. She marked none. And so Babylon passed from one moon into the next, from harvest toward flood, and in that long, slow turning, something astonishing began to happen. Not loudly, not dramatically, but like the smell of rain before the storm comes. Others began leaving things, a folded ribbon, a carved shell, a piece of pottery with a line of verse. First near her stall, then near the fig tree, then beside the temple's edge. At first, Enlila thought them coincidences, children's play, careless drop. But then she recognized the patterns. Each item bore care. Each had been placed, not lost. And each, though different in form, whispered the same thing. "We remember too." She said nothing, but one afternoon she caught sight of an older woman, a cloth merchant, pausing beside her stall and running her finger along the curve of the reed Enlila had tied to a basket. Their eyes met. No words passed, but the woman gave a small nod like a priest blessing a sacred text. In Murray, Dagan noticed the same. First, a note tucked into a jar, not addressed to him but to whoever speaks to the silence. Then a stone, freshly carved, placed beside his own spiral tablet. It read, "Your voice reached farther than you think." He touched the stone once and whispered, "She must have remained." For the first time in months, he laughed, not loudly, not bitterly, but gently, like a door creaking open after being sealed too long. And he carved nothing that night. He sat instead and let the ivy cover him in shadow. Love had survived the law, not by fighting it, not by challenging it, but by stepping sideways into something older than decree, the human need to hold what is sacred, even if it must be held in secret. And in that holding, others found their courage. Their silence became a gathering, their memory a movement. No name, no leader, just offerings. Fig and reed, clay and word. Shared across distance, carried by breath. And Babylon, though vast and ancient and unmoved by any single heart, held it all in its soil. Unseen, yes, but not unfelt. It began as a murmur, and then it stayed a murmur, not because it couldn't grow louder, but because in Babylon there were things too sacred to say aloud. The stone paths through the market still rang with sandals, the temple drums still called out time, and scrolls still carried judgment pressed into clay. Yet beneath all this movement and decree, the ground had shifted, slightly, permanently. The fig tree behind the temple bore its first bud in 3 seasons. It was not much, a single green bulb tucked beneath a fan of dusty leaves, but those who passed by it noticed. The elderly incense seller who came each week to offer prayers for his son lost in war touched his forehead to its bark. A temple girl, no older than 10, paused to place a clay token at its base, then ran off before anyone could ask why. And Enlila, when she saw the bud for the first time, did not cry. She only whispered, "You are still listening," and left a reed beside the root. She didn't ask whether the gods heard her. She no longer needed divine ears. She had the earth, and it remembered. By then, her jar of fragments was no longer private. She kept it in the open now at the back of her stall. Visitors rarely spoke of it. Some didn't notice. But others— a quiet woman from Kish, a mute boy with a basket of wild herbs, even the younger priests— touched the rim as they passed, offering no words, only the briefest nods. Once a man left a tablet in it without a name. Enlila read it that evening. She left, but I still walk as if she's beside me. I hope the city forgives me for pretending. Enlila placed that one inside a second jar, which she began keeping in her home. A place for echoes. And though she never wrote Dagan's name in any of these fragments, everything still whispered of him. Not his image, not his voice, but his presence, the stillness he carried, the quiet he gave her, the shape of what he had chosen not to say when others might have spoken in fear. He had left because they made him leave, but she remained because she chose to. And in that choice the city no longer pretended not to notice. One morning, the loud olive girl approached her stall, not with gossip, not with mischief, with a gift, a small folded leaf, dried and dyed with ash. "It's from someone in Mari," she said, then added, almost embarrassed, "I trade grain sometimes." I saw him from a distance. Enlila's hand did not tremble when she took it. She opened the leaf later beneath the fig tree. Inside, a reed stem, broken and tied at both ends. A circle. She didn't smile, but her lips parted just slightly, as though letting in a breeze. Far away, Dagan sat beside the wall that had become his second voice. The ivy now curled in wide sweeps, framing the tablets like scripture. Others had begun placing their own beside his. Not many, not often, but enough that the pattern had grown. He no longer rearranged them. He simply carved and added his own, gently, as if not to disturb a current larger than himself. He had learned to live with the ache, not to banish it, but to braid it into his movements, to let it inform how he shaped each line. He was different now, not thinner, not sadder, but hollowed in a way that made space inside him for silence. He spoke less, watched more, and in his stillness others found rest. The head scribe noticed. "Your prayers have grown wordless," he said one day, more observation than rebuke. Dagan only nodded. Some things should be remembered in the space between words. And the scribe, after a long pause, said, "Then let them be remembered." It was not approval. It was something older. Back in Babylon, the temple priest who once watched Enlila now passed her without pause. He had been reassigned, a gesture she understood. Babylon did not confront what it couldn't erase. It simply redirected attention until the past became architecture. But architecture remembers. And as the season leaned toward the river's rise, her stall grew quieter, her rituals sharper. Each action felt precise, deliberate. She no longer lit the lamp out of longing, but as thanks. She no longer buried tokens with hope of return, but with gratitude for what had been given. She began teaching others, not formally, not as a priestess, but in the soft murmurs of the dusk hour. A girl asked once, "Did you love him?" Enlila had paused, then replied, "I still do." Because love does not vanish. It becomes the way you move through the world. And that girl, not yet of marrying age, went home and shaped her first reed tablet, not to send, not to bury, but to keep beside her own lamp. Dagan never received messages. He had asked that none be sent, but he felt them. In the wind that brought a scent of figs even in the dust of Mari. In the silence that grew between one breath and the next, long enough for a name never spoken to feel present again. And in the moment just before sleep, when his hand curled not around a scroll, but around memory. He dreamt again that week of light filtered through market cloth, of the sound of her stall shutters opening, of the faint scratch of reed on clay. In the dream, she did not speak. She only held out her hands, and in them was nothing. And still he woke with a sense of being full, not complete, never that, but enough. They had become legend of a kind, not named, not carved into temple stone, but carried in gesture. A myth built not on miracle, but on endurance. And myths, once rooted, do not vanish. They deepen. They carry their truths forward in the mouths of those who need them. And so Babylon, vast, ancient, flawed, now hummed quietly with the echo of two souls who had dared to feel what law forbade, and who, in feeling, had reminded the city that even its oldest codes could not command the heart. In time, even cities learn to yield. Not all at once, not loudly, and never without resistance. But just as a reed grows through stone, or water finds its way beneath the thickest walls, so too does what is unspoken begin to soften the edges of the world around it. Babylon, fierce, glorious, full of law and fire, had begun to bend. Enlila noticed it first, not in words but in posture, the way the guards no longer slowed at her stall, the way temple scribes no longer glanced twice when she passed, the way her neighbors, once so quick with curiosity, now met her eyes with a calm sort of recognition. No one said anything. That, she had learned, was the city's signature. The ritual of noticing without naming. She herself had changed. Or perhaps more accurately, she had settled into the truth of what had always been. Her shoulders no longer tightened when someone mentioned Mari. Her voice, once kept low and sparse, now flowed more easily, not with chatter, but with surety. The kind of surety that comes when you have stood still long enough for the world to move around you, and you find you are still upright. And the fig tree, once stubborn, bare, and ignored, had begun to bud in earnest. 5 figs, small, green, unripe, but undeniably there. A sign that something unseen had taken hold, had chosen to remain. Children came more often now, drawn not just by the fruit, but by the quiet. They sat at her feet as she packed her wares, asked about the meaning of symbols carved into tablets, and listened as she spoke. Not in lessons, but in stories. Stories of winds that carried names too softly to hear, of rivers that knew how to listen, of offerings left not to gods, but to each other. She never named Dagan. That was the first gift she gave him, anonymity within memory. Letting his story become something more than one man, more than one loss. But she spoke of love, of the kind that doesn't conquer, doesn't burn, doesn't shout, the kind that waits, the kind that remembers. And in Mari, Dagan listened too, though to a different language. His temple work continued. He now led scroll preservation, his hand trusted, his lines precise. No one questioned his late nights, his hours spent near the outer garden wall. The wall had become something of a mystery now, a curiosity for visiting scribes, a place the children whispered about. They say it's a prayer wall, one young boy muttered once, watching Dagan arrange a new tile. It's not, Dagan replied softly. It's a memory. That silenced the boy. Tadu, the old scribe, still brought him tea sometimes. She said little. But once, when the ivy had nearly covered the lower third of the wall, she asked, "You ever going back?" Dagan didn't answer right away. His hands were dirty with clay, a small spiral of script drying beneath the sun. He finally said, "You don't return to the place you left. You return to what it became while you were gone." She nodded once and left. That night, he carved something different, not a memory, not a wish, a question. If the city no longer resists, does the river still carry the need to flee? He didn't place the tablet on the wall. He wrapped it in linen and left it with a merchant headed for Babylon. No instructions, no address. Just the mark of the reed and circle pressed faintly on the cloth, the symbol that had become their echo. The merchant, puzzled, placed it near the fig tree when he arrived. Enlila found it the next morning, nestled beneath the lowest branch. She opened it with slow fingers, tracing each word, each pause, and then she sat beside the roots and closed her eyes. She did not answer. Not yet, but something inside her began to shift. That week, she reopened a space she had not touched in months, the back room where her father once kept ledgers, now empty, dusty. She swept it, lit a lamp, sat with her thoughts, and then she began to write. Not a letter, not a message, but a record of days shared, of fragments found, of names unspoken. It took 3 nights to finish. When she was done, she sealed it in wax, marked only with the fig leaf symbol, and placed it in the hands of a temple courier bound north. She said only, "For the scribe in Marie. He will understand." When it arrived, Dagan received it with the reverence of a relic. He didn't read it at once. He waited until dusk when the garden grew still, and only the ivy moved. Then he opened the seal. The scroll inside was not long, but it held everything, not by name, not in confession, but in shape, her rhythm, her breath, her ritual. At the end, a single line stood alone. The tree has begun to bear. What do you want to plant next? He held the scroll for a long time after. Then he smiled, not with joy, not with triumph, but with understanding. And he rose, crossed the garden, and cleared a space beside the wall. There, with careful hands, he dug a hollow, pressed a seed into the earth, and whispered something the garden could keep. Not a promise, not a plan, but a beginning. And in Babylon, as the sun dipped below the temple's golden edge, Enlila stood once more beneath the fig tree and looked toward the horizon. The city behind her no longer resisted, and the path ahead no longer forbade. The river had swollen, not to flood, not yet, but enough that its sound changed. It no longer murmured beneath the bridges. It sang, a low, steady chant, like the breath of the earth itself exhaling. In Babylon, the people marked it with baskets of salt and grain laid beside the docks, gifts to the god Ea, keeper of waters, sender of warnings. But to Enlila, the river was not a threat. It was a messenger. She stood by its edge one morning just before first light, barefoot on the cool stone, her shawl clinging damply to her arms. The reeds swayed, barely brushing her calves. Behind her, the city had not yet woken. No temple bells, no market cries, no carts rattling over dust. Just water and wind and the echo of a question still humming through her bones. What do you want to plant next? She had read it again the night before, that line Dagan carved, not because she hadn't understood, but because understanding something doesn't make it easy to answer. So she came to the river, as she often had when she was young, back when her mother was alive and her father still joked, back before the law had become something she could feel in her pulse. She reached into the fold of her sash and withdrew a small reed, etched with the faintest spiral, and dropped it into the water. "Let the current know," she whispered, "before I do." The reed spun briefly, caught in a whirl of silt, then slipped into the current and vanished. Enlila turned, walked home, and began packing her stall with the same care she always did. But she knew something had shifted. Meanwhile, far north, Mari was steeped in the yellow gold light of its lean season. The sun hung low but burned sharp, drying the clay faster than it could be shaped. Dagan had learned to adjust his rhythm, mixing his tablets earlier in the day, carving in the shade, and waiting until twilight to touch the garden wall. It had become a place not just of memory now, but of exchange. Other scribes left poems there. A temple acolyte once tucked a lock of hair, wrapped in linen, behind one of the oldest tiles, whispering, "He never heard me." The wall had become a quiet cathedral, sacred not to gods, but to the things people dared not say aloud. Dagan kept to his spiral. That night he carved, "The water thickens. The air grows still. When the world prepares to shift, it always quiets first." He placed the tablet beneath the ivy, next to a seedling now poking through the soil, the one he'd planted after receiving her scroll. It had taken root, small but persistent, with 2 green shoots already curving toward the sun. No one knew what it would become. That perhaps was the point. 3 days later, the messenger arrived. Not a letter, a voice. A merchant woman, eyes sharp and smile faint, came to the temple with a delivery of ink. She paused as Dagan recorded the transaction, then added, "There's a woman in Babylon with a fig tree that shouldn't fruit. She says it has 5 now." Dagan didn't look up. "Should I tell her anything?" the woman asked. He folded the parchment slowly, then said, "Tell her the seed lives." The woman left, and Dagan, for the first time in over a year, asked the temple for leave to travel. It wasn't granted at once. The senior scribe hesitated. The head priest asked questions. Tadu, the old scribe, said nothing, but handed him a wrapped scroll. "This is yours," she said. "From long ago." He opened it that evening. It was his first spiral, the one he'd never placed on the wall, the one he thought he'd lost. "You are the center of a quiet I never knew I carried." He folded it with care. In Babylon, Enlila had begun preparing her home, not to leave it, not yet, but to let it be ready, for change, for growth, for the possibility that presence could return. She reopened the back room again, aired the mats, burned myrtle leaves for their sweetness. She gathered her jars of memory, not to hide them, but to arrange them. Each fragment, each symbol, each token had a place now, not beneath the bed, but on shelves, visible, respected. The children noticed first. One asked, "Why do you keep all these?" She answered gently, "Because memory grows best when it's not buried." They helped her dust, and when she wasn't looking, one child placed a freshly carved clay heart at the base of the fig tree, stamped with the shape of a spiral. Enlila knelt before it later, touched the cool clay, and whispered, "He's already on his way, isn't he?" The wind lifted the scent of ripening figs toward the sky. She waited, not with stillness, with rhythm. Each morning she opened the stall. Each evening she lit the lamp. And one morning, after rain had softened the stones and the market air was thick with fresh bread and sesame, a shadow moved across her stall's awning. She turned, hands still deep in the fig basket. He stood at the edge of the crowd, not in temple robes, just simple travel cloth. Hair longer, eyes quieter, hands tucked behind his back. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. She stepped out from the stall. She didn't run, she didn't cry. She walked slowly until they stood only a breath apart. Then she lifted her hand and touched his cheek, a gesture so small, so quiet, it might have gone unnoticed by the world. But Babylon felt it. The market didn't pause, the priests didn't shout, the city simply allowed it. And in that moment, something more than memory bloomed, not loudly, not in defiance, just in truth. In the first days after his return, they did not speak of separation. That was not a story needing retelling. It had already been whispered through. Every fig ripened without his hand to touch it, every reed pressed into clay by her alone, every shadow stretched long across Babylon's stone that remembered where he once walked. The city might not have named what passed between them, but it had recorded it all the same, in silence and scent, in rhythm and ritual. So when Dagan stood beside her stall, his fingers brushing the edge of the basket as if unsure if it was still allowed, and Enlila stepped forward to meet him, it was not reunion, it was return. A long breath finally released, a name remembered not just by the tongue but by the air itself. They walked together that morning, not hand in hand but side by side, letting the city witness without permission. The sun climbed slow, slanting gold over the rooftops. He said little, she said less. They moved like people relearning the shape of things, not just each other, but the world as seen through each other's presence. The fish seller shouted a greeting. A boy threw a date stone into the gutter. A priest passed and paused, eyes flicking toward Dagan's face. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. Babylon had already moved on, and yet in its unspoken way it was watching, not to judge, but to record. This was what it did best, hold moments not as declarations, but as evidence of what endured. Back at her home, he did not enter at once. He stood in the doorway, the light behind him casting a long shadow across the threshold. She gestured once, a tilt of her head, a lifting of the hand. That was all it took. He crossed into her space, not as a visitor, not as a guest, but as one who had never fully left. And yet, everything had changed. He noticed it in the smallest things. The jar of memory fragments now sat in the open. The reed tablets were arranged by type: joy, longing, resilience. A second jar, labeled Echo, sat beside the first. He ran his hand gently along their rims, as if afraid they might vanish. She watched him, arms crossed loosely, not guarding, simply holding herself steady. They did not embrace. They did not cry. Instead, he picked up a reed stylus from her writing board, turned it once between his fingers, and said, "You still use the same weight?" She smiled, that slow, careful smile he remembered. "It balances well." And just like that, the world began again. They did not rush into the shape of couplehood. That word, after all, had always felt too small. What they shared had never fit the forms given by law or family. There were no dowries, no feasts, no temple blessing. Only shared bread, shared breath, and the slowly interwoven details of daily life. He did not move in at first. He stayed with a friend near the scribe's quarter, helping copy legal codices for the city record. A task he took up again, not from duty, but from steadiness. His presence there, calm and sure, quieted any lingering suspicion. Babylon, pragmatic as always, understood that people who worked were people who belonged. And when he wasn't in the script house, he was with her, sweeping the front step of her stall, retying bundles of dried herbs, sitting with her through long silences as she peeled skins from ripe figs and laid them out to dry. Their conversations were sparse at first, not out of discomfort but out of reverence. Each word carried weight now, not because of history, but because of care. They had survived the space between. They had built a language of gesture, of proximity, of patience. They were not about to clutter that with words spoken too soon. Sometimes he wrote instead, small lines pressed into palm-sized clay. The way you move when you think no one is watching. This silence does not frighten me. It sounds like home. I forgot how you hum when tying knots. She kept them tucked beneath the mat near her bed, rereading them in the dusk hour. And she too began writing again, not to him, to herself, as if learning her own voice anew. She realized she had grown used to shaping her life as a question. Will he return? Will the city allow it? Will the memory last? Now she was learning to write in statements. Today we sold 2 jars of myrtle. The air smelled of cumin, and he smiled. I'm not waiting anymore. I'm sharing. Dagan found one of those notes once, left on the table, and placed beside it a fig leaf, dry and curled, shaped into a spiral. They were not hiding, but neither were they declaring. It was a kind of sacred in-betweenness, no longer forbidden, not quite celebrated, but completely theirs. A shared sacredness that belonged to no temple, no decree. One night, as the moon rose wide over the ziggurat and the city's hum faded into lull, Enlila stood beneath the fig tree and ran her fingers along its bark. It had borne more fruit this season, enough for a small basket, enough to call it generous. She whispered, "You see? Even this tree found a way to forgive the drought." Behind her, Dagan approached with slow steps. He carried a new scroll, wrapped in linen, sealed with wax. He handed it to her, wordlessly. She opened it by the light of a single oil lamp. Inside, a record of their shared fragments. Every line he had ever carved, every message left at the ivy wall in Mari, each one copied by hand, translated, annotated. At the bottom, in his clean, sure script, "I have kept our story. Will you keep writing it with me?" She looked up, met his gaze, and answered not with speech, but with a soft kiss to his forehead, the first touch of that kind since he'd returned. Then she whispered, "We already are." And in that small space, 2 breaths wide, 2 shadows long, a history continued, not loud, not grand, but enduring. Babylon exhaled, and the river sang on. It had been nearly a year since Dagan first returned to Babylon. A full turning of the seasons, from the dryness of fig skin to the sudden sweetness of flood fruit through the cold winds of the low sun, and now once more into the early swelter that pressed clay hard before the day was even halfway through. And in that time, something remarkable had unfolded. Not a return to what had been lost, but the quiet building of something entirely new. They were no longer 2 people hiding from a city's eyes. They had become part of the city's rhythm, no longer feared, no longer forbidden. Just there, familiar, steady, like the slow shift of light across a tiled wall. Enlila's stall had grown, not in size, but in weight. People came not just to buy dried fruit or barley cakes. They came to pause, to leave tokens, to speak a line they had carved in secret or share a memory they had not dared admit even to themselves. It had become, without announcement, a sanctuary, not from the law, but from the silence that often followed it. Sometimes they brought tablets, etched in nervous hands, unsure whether anyone would read them. Enlila read everyone, sometimes aloud, sometimes just with her eyes. Some she returned, some she kept. One she pressed gently into Dagan's hands when he returned from the archive late one evening. He read it beneath the oil lamp's quiet flicker. It said only, "I loved once, and never said it. This is me saying it now." He placed it gently beside the others, resting it under a sprig of lavender. They were still not married, not in the eyes of the temple, but neither of them seemed to feel the absence of that decree. Their bond had long outlasted parchment. Instead, they marked their time in rituals of their own, preparing food together each evening, pressing their fingers into clay side by side on slow mornings, listening to the children recite lines of poetry that had no author and yet were always theirs. Dagan had become something of a guide to the temple scribes again, though not officially. He was too gentle now to command, too quiet to lead. but they gathered near him regardless, not for instruction, but for example. He worked slower than he once had, each line more deliberate, as if every word might be the last he ever carved. When asked why, he simply said, "Because the world does not always forgive rushed truth." One of the younger scribes, a boy with quick eyes and too much nervous energy, asked him once, "Is it true, you and the woman from the stall?" Dagan met his gaze, steady as stone. "What would you do with the truth if I gave it to you?" The boy flushed, stammered, and turned away. But Dagan did not laugh. He understood. Curiosity was not malice. It was the ache of recognition. Enlila, too, had her visitors. The olive girl had grown into a woman now, her tongue no less sharp, but her steps more thoughtful. She came by each week with questions disguised as banter. Once, she asked, "If you could do it over, hide it better or love someone less complicated, would you?" Enlila paused only a moment. "No," she said, because it was never about getting away with it. It was about getting to have it at all. The olive girl, for once, had no response. The fig tree, meanwhile, had come fully into its second season. It bore fruit in clusters now, not large, but rich, thick-skinned, fragrant. Children climbed its lower limbs. Women left offerings in the crook of its roots. Someone had hung a string of shell beads from one branch, and no one took it down. It was, to those who didn't ask questions, a tree. To those who had ever waited, ever endured, ever remembered, it was proof of something that lived even when silence tried to bury it. Dagan began keeping a second wall, not of clay tablets, of scrolls, the gathered lines of others, copied from the offerings left at the stall, etched into wax, dried in sun, bound in strips of cloth. He tied them together, page after page, and placed them in a woven basket that he left outside the scriptorium. Anyone could read them. No names, no places, just voices, Babylon's anonymous gospel. Sometimes he added his own lines, but he never signed them. One evening, as the wind cooled the last edge of the day, Enlila brought out an old mat and laid it on the roof of their home. She invited him up, wordlessly. They sat together, legs crossed, watching the lights blink slowly across the far edge of the city. The stars above were faint, veiled by the haze of heat still rising off the stone, but one or two made themselves known. She pointed upward, tracing nothing in particular. He took her hand, fingers wrapping slowly around her wrist, and said, "Do you think the gods are still watching?" She answered without pause, "I think they were never the ones who needed convincing." He smiled, that quiet, grateful smile that didn't ask for anything more than what already was. And for a while they simply sat, two silhouettes against the hum of an ancient city, beneath the sky that had seen so many stories swallowed before they could finish, and yet had allowed this one to linger. It was no longer about hiding. It wasn't even about surviving. It was about presence. They were here. They had loved, they still did. And the city, for all its lore and lineage, had not managed to erase them. The river still flowed, the priests still chanted, the scribes still etched judgments in stone. But within it all, between the cracks in the scent of figs and the curl of reeds, their story had taken root, and the earth held it close. By the time the third season passed since his return, even the youngest children in the quarter had begun to forget that Dagan had ever been gone. That was how cities worked, not by erasing, but by folding. What had once been scandal became myth, then memory, then just a story carried in a market's wind. And in Babylon, where the stone pathways always bore the pressure of new feet, even the most sacred silences were eventually worn smooth. But there was a difference between being forgotten and being absorbed. Dagan and Enlila were not forgotten. They had simply become part of the place, as natural and enduring as the fig tree by the temple wall or the curl of incense that rose with each morning's prayers. There was no longer a need to speak of what had happened. It had happened, it had lasted, and that, in Babylon's own ancient way, was enough. Dagan had grown slower, not from age, but from ease. His hands, once always in motion with stylus and script, now paused often, not from hesitation, but from appreciation. He noticed the cracks in the stone steps leading to Enlila's home, and the way one pigeon always seemed to sleep in the same crook of the eaves. He noticed how she hummed while grinding grain, how her shoulders relaxed finally when she moved through the market. He took joy in the ordinary now, not as a substitute for passion, but as its final, ripened form. There had been a time when their love had burned against the edges of legality, when every glance had been stolen, every moment temporary. Now it was a fire kept low and constant, warming the home, needing no more fuel than breath and time. Enlila, for her part, no longer feared the shadows. She welcomed dusk now. There was a calm to it, the long sigh of a city settling into its bones. She found herself waking before sunrise and walking the streets alone, listening to the hush before noise returned. It reminded her of how their story had begun, not with declarations, but with watching, with being willing to witness something before claiming it. The fig tree was taller now, taller than her, even taller than Dagan, its branches heavy with late-season fruit. One morning she found a tablet tucked between two limbs, damp from the dew, yet still legible. The clay was fresh, the carving careful. It read, "For those who taught the city how to remember." She didn't ask who had left it. She didn't need to. There was a kind of reverence forming now, well, not worship, never that, but respect. Not for who they were, but for what they had held together. Young lovers still passed by her stall and touched the jars. Older ones paused to meet Dagan's gaze and nod, as though to say, "We saw. We understand. We're grateful." And yet life was not standing still. The world around them continued, unbothered by their quiet. New laws were carved, crops failed in the north, a minor prince fell out of favor. These things reached the market like slow echoes, changing nothing in the rhythm of Enlila's day. She folded herbs, bundled grain, carved tokens, received poems. Once, a girl asked her how love survived time. Enlila answered, "By not asking time to stop." Dagan watched her say it from a distance. He smiled to himself, quietly, the way he always did when she said something that felt older than either of them. And then he turned back to his scrollwork, not clay this time, but parchment, carefully inked, a rare task given to those with a steady hand. He had begun copying the scrolls of others now, not official ones, but those left by the nameless. The fragments of longing, remembrance, beginnings and ends. He had collected over 100. They lived in a cedar box beneath his writing table. One afternoon, when the heat hung low and the temple bell had not yet rung for rest, he brought the box to Enlila. She raised an eyebrow. "All of them?" "Not all," he said, "just the ones I want to plant." Together they walked to the fig tree. Its roots were wide now, strong, anchoring it deep in the soil where her first tokens had once been buried. He knelt there, cleared a space, and began placing the scrolls into the earth, not as offerings, as a garden, as seed. Enlila watched him with quiet breath, then reached into her sash and pulled free a reed, not new, but old, worn soft with time. She placed it in the hollow beside the scrolls, then helped him cover them, pressing the soil gently with care. Later that evening, as the stars emerged pale and few, and the market sounds faded into distant murmurs, she asked, "Do you ever wish we had done things differently?" He didn't answer at first. The oil lamp between them flickered low, throwing their shadows in long, thin loops along the walls. "No," he said finally, "because if we had, we might not have lasted. And I'd rather have lived in exile and returned to you than stayed in safety and never known you at all." She leaned back against the wall, eyes closed, the scent of fig bark drifting through the shutters. The silence between them was not absence. It was fullness. Outside, the city of Babylon breathed on, stone and scroll, market and temple. But deep within its belly, in the places between law and longing, a different record had taken hold. One not etched by decree or command, but pressed gently into the clay of memory, tended by those who had learned that love is not what breaks the rules, but what endures when the rules forget how to feel. And it was in that quiet, in that dusk-soaked hour, that Dagan reached across the distance and touched Enlila's hand. Not for comfort, not for promise, just for presence. Because presence, at last, was theirs. The mornings were quieter now, not from loss or emptiness, but from arrival. A sense that everything which had once hurried now no longer needed to. Babylon still woke with the same rustling sounds. Carts over dry stone, merchants clearing their throats, the caws of birds pecking at fig skins dropped from stalls. But for Dagan and Enlila, time had thickened into something slow and reverent, like oil poured over cool clay. It was not that the city had changed. The temple still buzzed with incantations, scrolls still passed from hand to hand, but their place within it had shifted, not elevated, not exiled, just rooted. The fig tree bore fruit in full this year, thick clusters that bent the branches low enough for children to reach. People no longer left offerings in secret. They brought them openly now, not just to Enlila, but to the tree itself, to the soil beneath it, to the quietness it had come to represent. A woman came once, shaking slightly, her face lined by time and salt, and left a bowl of milk at its base. When Enlila gently asked for whom it was meant, the woman answered, "For the part of me I couldn't speak aloud until I watched you two." And she left without waiting for reply. Enlila told Dagan that night, her voice folded into the soft linen of his shoulder, and he only kissed the crown of her head and said, "Then we did not endure in vain." They never married. There had been no announcement. No formal union carved in cuneiform or blessed by priests, but none of that was needed anymore. When the gods had chosen to look away, the earth had chosen to remember. Their rituals were daily ones, preparing meals together, pressing reed to clay, passing quiet glances across the table when the oil lamp flickered as if remembering something only they could see. One morning, Dagan returned from the temple archives with ink on his fingers and a smile he hadn't worn in years. "They asked me to write a history," he said. "Not a state history, a living one, about things the law missed." Enlila raised an eyebrow. "And what will you call it?" He looked toward the window, where the fig tree swayed in a late morning breeze, and said, "The things that remained." He did not write their names into the scroll, but he didn't need to. Their story pulsed through every sentence, not as subject, but as soil. The foundation, the proof. He wrote of market rhythms and rituals passed between hands, of offerings placed in hollows no official would see, of the way people shaped silence into a kind of resistance. And he wrote of a tree that bore fruit without permission, and a stall where broken hearts became whole by speaking only fragments. When he finished, Enlila read it first. She said nothing until the very end, Then, looking up with tears that did not fall, she said, "It will outlast us." He smiled. "I hope it outgrows us." As the scroll began to circulate, hand to hand, copied and recopied by those who saw themselves in its quiet, something unspoken began to form. A festival, not declared by priests, not ordained by temple decree, but born from shared memory. People began gathering near the fig tree each year, at the edge of the flood season, leaving stories wrapped in cloth, whispering names that the laws had tried to silence. No one called it a festival. It was simply called the Evening of Remembering. By then, Dagan had grown slower. His legs ached more. He slept earlier, woke later. Enlila, too, had lines in her hands now that matched the grooves of old styluses, of baskets woven again and again. But their love, whatever name others gave it, had ripened into something vast and calm. It was no longer about endurance, it was about care. And still they walked each morning to the fig tree, placed a hand to its bark, and greeted it like an old friend. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the ziggurat and the sky turned the color of honey steeped in dusk, Enlila sat beside Dagan on the rooftop. The stars came out slowly, one by one, as if listening first. The warmth of the day still clung to the clay beneath them. She placed her head against his shoulder and whispered, "It was never about winning, was it?" He shook his head. Number It was about remaining, about not letting the world erase what mattered. They stayed like that until night deepened. He died in the late hours of a spring morning while she slept beside him, her hand resting loosely against his chest. It was a quiet passing, the kind that only comes when nothing remains unsaid. No messengers ran, no bells tolled. The city, ever ancient, simply folded the loss into its rhythm. Enlila mourned without spectacle. She closed the stall for 3 days. She lit oil beside the fig tree. She wrote no dirge. Instead, she carved a reed tablet and buried it in the hollow where they had once placed the scrolls. It read, "You taught the silence how to listen." She stayed in their home, tended the tree, greeted those who came to offer fragments. Her steps slowed, her voice softened, but her presence never dimmed. In time, people forgot their names, but the stall remained. And each year, on the same flood-sweet evening, someone placed a scroll or a reed beneath the tree. A child might ask, well, why do they do that? And an elder would answer, because once, love survived what should have erased it. And Babylon, great and old, whispered, back through stone and soil, yes, yes it did.